It doesn't start with a bang but with a breath, a calm which descends over France's fields like a heavy mist. The year is 1917, and the world is engulfed in a conflict greater than anything which has gone before. More than 3 years, millions of men, war and death across Europe's battered face. And so it is that we arrive in a French town. A tiny place, Cambrai. But Cambrai is more than a dot on the map. It is silent, yes, but not quiet. The crunch of boots on wooden duckboards, the soft murmur of officers huddled over maps, the far-off whine of guns, ever constant, like the hum of an ailing world. The men here are familiar with the cadence of war. They are familiar with the odor of damp wool and cordite. They are familiar with the flavor of ration biscuits, the feel of mud, the silence before a command is delivered. This is the Western Front, and this is the quiet before the storm. The Cambrai battlefield was different. It wasn't the typical muddy crater-filled mire at locations such as Passchendaele or Ypres. No, this ground was harder, drier, chalky soil that could bear movement, not only of infantry, but of something new, something different. The British High Command saw it. General Julian Byng, who led the Third Army, had had enough of the bloody stalemate of trench warfare. He felt a chance at Cambrai, a chance to experiment with something unconventional. He suggested a small-scale surprise attack in this quiet area, not an extended grinding war, but a quick coordinated jab, in and out. What made Cambrai revolutionary wasn't the strategy alone, it was the machinery, the Mark IV tank. And so, to put this into perspective, visualize the battlefield so far. Men advancing across open fields, through wire entanglements, into machine gun fire. Each yard of ground captured cost hundreds of lives. The tank, it was hoped, could alter that. It wasn't the first time tanks were employed in World War I. They had first appeared during the Somme offensive of 1916, but then only in limited numbers. At that time, they were not dependable, clumsy, of a tendency to break down. But at Cambrai, they would emerge not in dozens, but in hundreds. More than 470 tanks were moved to the front. This was a huge logistical effort. The tanks needed to be moved secretly, transported under cover of darkness and silence. Special roads were constructed, fuel, ammunition and spare parts stored, and most importantly, secrecy was a must. The Germans had no clue what was heading their way. And with the tanks, a new style of artillery tactics predicted fire. Rather than opening bombardments that warned the enemy of an impending attack, the British artillery would shoot straight away at German positions based on mathematical calculation, the aim to surprise the Germans. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it was totally unlike anything yet tried during the war. But beneath the plans and the numbers, the true Cambrai story starts with the men. Picture a young British tank crew, sitting cramped within the iron monstrosity they'd named Deborah. The walls shake with every jolt, the air is thick with oil, sweat and fear. Their hands shake, not from cold but from knowing what tomorrow would bring. Outdoors, bayonets are fixed by infantrymen. Some double-check and triple-check their equipment. Others sit in silence, holding pictures of loved ones or writing last letters they will perhaps never mail. The chaplain gives a silent benediction to a group of boys on their knees who look much too young to be at war. And then the noise. At first a whisper, low grunts, as if beasts stirring from slumber, then increasingly louder. Rhythmic. The tanks are warming up. Their engines rumble into life. Together, hundreds of them, a noise so fresh, so unnatural, that even the troops can't help but experience both awe and terror. To the Germans mere yards away across no man's land, it would have sounded like thunder breaking out of the earth itself. As night wears off, a ghostly pre-dawn mist clings close to the ground. The stars disappear. Watches are aligned. 0 hour approaches. In a buried command post, General Byng drinks lukewarm tea and waits. A moment later, a signal flashes along the lines. November 20th, 1917, 6:20 a.m. The Battle of Cambrai is on. The earth shudders. British guns erupt into life. More than 1,000 guns blazing in precise coordinated rhythm. There is no warning. No rolling barrage, just raw fury. German trenches erupt. Barbed wire is eradicated in shrapnel. Machine gun nests are cut down before they can fire a shot, and in the smoke, the tanks advance. Row on row of steel beasts move slowly forward, running over all before them. Some are carrying fascines, enormous bundles of wood, tied to their front to bridge trenches. Others are taking engineers to blast away obstructions. They roll forward, preceded by infantrymen, who march closely behind, using the tanks for protection. The Germans are shocked and caught in the open. Many are unable to cope. Positions that had been held for years are taken in hours. By noon, the British had done the impossible, a 5-mile penetration. That does not sound like much, but in trench warfare, it was a miracle. It was a shock wave that spread from Cambrai to London. The news of the victory spread quickly. Church bells echoed throughout Britain. The headlines hailed the tank victory at Cambrai. The men who had battled their way through infinite mud and carnage at Passchendaele at last sensed a spark of hope. But even as their joy was stirring, those in the trenches realized the truth. It wasn't yet over. Most of the tanks had malfunctioned. Others were destroyed by the enemy. Tank infantry communication was still awkward, and the Germans, though shaken, were hardly defeated. By evening, the battlefield was a combination of victory and unease. Flares illuminated the sky. Medics eased through the casualties. Soldiers crouched in hastily excavated trenches, rifles clutched tightly, waiting to hear the rumble of counterattack. And tank crews, tired, sweat-soaked and oiled, slept within their iron coffins, not knowing if they'd roll again at dawn. And thus came the first day of the Battle of Cambrai. A day that started in silence, erupted into history, and fell into uneasy stillness once again. It was a day that changed what could be done on the battlefield. A day that demonstrated that surprise, coordination, and innovation could shatter the stalemate of trench warfare, if only temporarily. More than strategy or steel, however, Cambrai was about men. Regular men, farmers, factory workers, students, men who emerged from their trenches that morning and marched into a new world of war, one defined by machines, mathematics and moments of bravado. They had no idea what the subsequent days would be like. They had no idea if the gains would last. They did know, for a moment at least, that the war had altered, and they were there when it occurred. The sun had hardly edged over the frigid November horizon when the world around Cambrai exploded, not in confusion, but in deliberate wrath. It was November 20th, 1917, and as the initial wisps of light touched the frozen fields, something entirely new to both friend and enemy started to happen. The Battle of Cambrai was not another advance through mud and wire. It wasn't a blank human wave. No, it was precision, it was innovation, and it was quiet until it wasn't. What distinguished this day was not merely the quantity of tanks, it was the way it all fit together. For the very first time in the war, the British armed forces had marshaled a complete symphony of combined arms maneuver. The battlefield, formerly a stage of brutish stamina, was now a chessboard, and the British were launching their boldest gambit yet. The awakening of steel giants. By 6:20 a.m., the earth shook, not from the enemy, but from the thunder of 476 British tanks, the largest mechanized army ever employed to that date. From their launch positions around Havrincourt and Flesquières, they advanced in tidy lines over open fields, a spectacle that impressed awe even into the breasts of their own soldiers. Each was a mechanical fortress, armored over, with machine guns or 6-pounder guns. But they were also hot, cramped, tricky and tortuously slow. Crews sweated inside them beneath layers of wool, leather and tension. The engines thundered inches from their ears, obscuring everything but the crash of shells ahead. The tanks advanced in diamond formations, closely supported by waves of infantry. These troops had been especially trained to fight alongside the tanks. They moved in the shelter of the tanks, prepared to cover them from German grenadiers and flamethrowers. The tanks, for their part, were prepared to smash barbed wire, blast trench walls and clear the way for their friends. No warning, no mercy. One of the most important innovations at Cambrai was artillery tactics. In the past, battles were preceded by days of concentrated shelling to weaken enemy defenses, but that usually compromised the surprise and allowed no flexibility. British gunners at Cambrai employed predicted fire for the first time on a large scale. With purely mathematical methods and thorough intelligence, they fired at German strongpoints without any advance shelling. The Germans were not even warned. The effect was catastrophic. Exactly at 6:20 a.m., more than 1,000 guns let go simultaneously. The opening rounds hit strategic trench lines, gun emplacements, machine gun nests, and barbed wire bottlenecks, all at the same time. The shells shrieked down through the morning fog, crashing into the ground with fiendish fury. German soldiers, anticipating a quiet sector, were left bewildered. And then there were the tanks. The advance, victory in miles not inches. The British came forward with 6 infantry divisions, each proficient in the new emerging art of coordinated attack. They followed behind the tanks, taking advantage of them as cover. When a tank became trapped or disabled, the infantry moved around it like water. Tanks, which carried fascines, enormous bundles of wood, dropped them across German trenches to make crossings. Others rolled over barbed wire fences that had halted thousands in earlier battles. Machine gunners blasted through armored openings as they moved by dugouts, clearing them with cannon blasts. In some places, church bells tolled in British towns as news of progress seeped back home. Within less than 12 hours, the British had made more gains than they had in 3 months at Passchendaele. Havrincourt, Ribecourt, and Marcoing fell to the British. It was not only a win, it was a revelation. The Cambrai ground, chalky and level, was perfect for tank travel. Swamps, deep craters that held water, and bottlenecks were non-existent. For one fleeting moment, it seemed that the war had turned. But it wasn't easy everywhere. Perhaps the most crucial and most tragic moment of the day occurred at Flesquieres Ridge. There, German artillery units enjoyed an unobstructed view over the advancing British. The tanks, dark shapes against the skyline, were easy pickings. One German artillery officer, whose name is still disputed, was able to knock out as many as 16 tanks in a few hours. The ridge was turned into a graveyard of armored steel. Infantry that moved behind those tanks were caught out in the open, pinned down by sniper and machine gun fire. Scores were killed, and the pace slowed in that sector. Despite that, the British pushed on. Engineers behind the tanks fixed broken roads and bridges to maintain supply lines. Behind the lines, cavalry units, yes, horse-mounted troops stood by, ready to take advantage of any breakthrough. It was one of the last uses of cavalry in a big European battle. In spite of the defeat at Flesquieres, the overall British advance continued. At the end of the day, more than 7,500 German troops had been taken prisoner. Hundreds of rifles and ammunition stores were captured. British troops had pushed forward 5 or 6 miles in places, something previously considered impossible in trench warfare. The soldier's perspective, in the midst of steel and strategy, were the men. Private George Denton of the Royal Tank Regiment later recorded in his diary, "The machine shivered like a huge beast, and we rolled onward into fog. I could not see 5 feet ahead, but I could hear the cries, the bursts, the screech of shells overhead. It was like riding into hell on 1,000 iron horses." For infantryman Harold Strong, the tanks brought comfort and fear. You never knew when the thing would break down, and inside, it was hotter than the devil's kitchen, but better a tank beside you than no cover at all. Few had ever even seen a tank before that week. Now they were depending on them to stay alive. Behind the lines, medics rushed to treat the wounded. With morphine and hasty bandages, messengers dashed through shellfire with orders. Officers pored over maps by candlelight, planning the next move, and all along, the tanks rolled on, tortuously, inexorably, a deafening wave of progress. Aftermath of Day 1. As evening settled over the battlefield, the British troops dug in, weary, chilled and anxious. They realized that the day ahead could bring counterattacks. But they also realized that they had done something unparalleled. There was a thick smoke and frost in the air. The thunder of tank engines dropped away into the night. Lanterns glowed in dugouts as men wrote letters, bandaged wounds, and men took up guard. Across the fields, the tanks loomed like slumbering giants, some operational, others useless heaps of metal. And the German lines,
once so proud, had been broken and stunned. Reflection. The first day of the Battle of Cambrai was a historic breakthrough. It demonstrated that trench lines were breakable, that surprise and coordination could succeed, that machines could transform the battlefield forever. But to the men who fought it, it was not about strategy or glory, it was about survival, about the look in a friend next to you, about the warmth in a tank, about the instant you stepped off behind that moving sheet of metal, your heart pounding, and you didn't know if you ever would make it home. It was about ending the quiet, with steel. The excitement of the British push on November 20th, 1917, had introduced a welcome taste of triumph. For the first time in years, the Western Front armies had seen something novel: movement, actual quantifiable movement, not in yards, but in miles. But even as jubilation broke out throughout Britain and optimism glimmered in hearts weary of war, the Cambrai front lines were beginning to shift. Under the frozen earth and burning rubble, Germany was not done. The tide was turning, and with it so too was the war's rhythm. The price of surprise, whereas the first day of battle had been a work of art in terms of planning and precision, the following days revealed the boundaries of warfare in the early 20th century. The British had pushed boldly forward with tanks, anticipated artillery and close unit cooperation.
That's almost 90,000 human lives lost in a maelstrom of bullets, flames, mud, and smoke, all for a piece of ground that by the end of the battle resembled nearly its original position. But figures, in a sense, lie. They quantify human experience. So let's get deeper. Each casualty wasn't simply a statistic, it was a name. A son from Leeds who had just been a father, a Prussian schoolmaster who longed to write poetry, a Scottish farmer who had never previously left his village, a Bavarian musician, young, whose fingers once danced across piano keys now splintered by shrapnel. Behind each wounded label was someone like Private Alfred Mears, who had both legs blown off by a mortar and spent the remainder of his life in a wheelchair. Behind each missing was someone like Sergeant Carl Weiss, whose body was never recovered, whose family never knew closure. Cambrai was a battlefield, but it was also a graveyard, some marked, some not. The wounded and the dying in the days following the fighting, the dressing stations and aid posts overflowed. Stretcher bearers, unarmed and frequently in the line of fire, pulled comrades wounded from no man's land, their boots sliding on bloodied chalk and frozen mud. Field medics worked by candlelight, frequently without morphine. Many had to amputate limbs with little more than ether and hope. Some men requested to be left behind. Others asked for letters to be sent home. The injured were carried in horse-drawn ambulances, their groans with each jolt. If they reached the casualty clearing station, they could live, or they might become one of the names added to the lists on telegrams home. Telegrams were dreaded by families in England and Germany. The visit to the door, the envelope covered with military symbols, the precisely typed phrase, "Regret to inform you." Prisoners of war. Cambrai also witnessed one of the war's biggest prisoner captures. During the initial British push, over 10,000 German troops were taken prisoner. Some surrendered in large groups, brandishing white cloths. Others were pulled from dugouts at bayonet point. These troops, weary, freezing, and frequently wounded, were marched off to improvised prison camps. While the German counterattack was underway, British thousands of soldiers were surrounded or cut off. Whole sections of trenches were overrun, which resulted in large numbers of British captures. It was sometimes a blessing and a curse to be taken prisoner. Survival, but cold, hunger and humiliation, censored letters home, meager food, and guards, while sometimes not cruel, were usually uncaring about misery. In post-war interviews, numerous POWs recalled Cambrai as the day everything changed. One German corporal later wrote, "We watched their machines roll toward us like metal dragons. We had no defense, and yet within a week we had them running again. The ground drank too much blood." The civilians of Cambrai. Amid all this, we must not forget the civilians. Cambrai itself was a French town which had been in German occupation since 1914. Throughout the battle, several of the surrounding villages found themselves in the firing line. Houses were bombarded, churches were set alight, stock ran into woods, whole families cowered in cellars or basements, hoping the battle would sail by them. When British troops entered towns such as Marcoing and Mosnières, they usually encountered old women and children huddled onto what remained of their possessions. They were half-starved. Others were shell-shocked by the sudden change in their daily imprisonment, and as suddenly as the British came, back came the Germans. These civilians were caught in a war between empires, their houses in ruins, their fate unknown. Even to this day, Cambrai's memorials and cemeteries are not only for soldiers but for the villagers who did not have a choice in the war that devastated their world. Psychological scars. We always discuss war in terms of numbers, but psychological wounds were just as deep. The men who survived Cambrai rarely spoke of it in full. Many returned home with what was then called shell shock. Today we'd call it PTSD. They flinched at loud noises, they stared blankly for hours. Some couldn't sleep, others couldn't speak. They had seen too much. Survivors' letters frequently spoke of dreams, tanks crushing over bodies, men screaming under collapsed trench ruins, horses burning alive in the artillery. Others attempted to resume normal life. Cambrai never released them, however. One of the soldiers, Lieutenant Henry Clark, wrote this way: "Waking from a dream you couldn't awaken from. Daily, the rumble of the tank engine tormented me, and the faces I left behind still follow me when I close my eyes." After the guns fell silent, when the combat finally ceased, and the guns fell quiet on December 7th, Cambrai re-established itself as what much of the Western Front had by now become, a land of unsettling quiet. Cratered fields, scorched forests, destroyed villages, lost helmets and rifles half submerged in frost. The dead were collected, wherever they could be. Others were still buried beneath collapsed tunnels and bottomless mud. Grave registration teams trudged through the land, gathering dog tags, indicating burial sites. Chaplains offered prayers over hastily constructed wooden crosses. Names were taken, or not, and gradually as winter's quiet descended, the silence resumed. Not peace, just absence. The British would not retain much of the territory they won. The Germans would not regain all that they had lost. Cambrai became just another name on a long list of battles, characterized not by its strategic outcome but by what it did to men who fought it. Memory over medals. Today, when we stand at the Cambrai Memorial in Louverval, we read the names of more than 7,000 British and South African servicemen who have no grave to which they may be returned. Each name an individual, each individual a tale. There are added German names, French village folk, and innumerable others who never came back. Cambrai is remembered by historians as a turning point in military strategy. Cambrai is a lesson about innovation and transience for the world. But to those who witnessed it, and to those who loved them, Cambrai is remembered in tears, silence, and vacant chairs around dinner tables. The war machine fell silent, and the fields about Cambrai became quiet once more. Not peace, never peace, but a quiet, uneasy stillness that rolled over the torn-up earth like morning mist. The battlefield was silent, but the minds of those who saw it never would be. The Battle of Cambrai was over, formally, on the 7th of December 1917. The last shell had fallen, the last counterattack had dissipated, the dead were being tallied, and the earth, ripped and cratered by weeks of rage, was starting to freeze again in the early clasp of winter. But whereas the army's advance had ceased, the effects of Cambrai were just starting to ripple out into the military mind, into politics, into homes and into memory. A tactical revolution, written in blood. Cambrai did not end in a clear-cut win or loss. That alone makes it an intriguing turning point in the war. Once the smoke had lifted, the front lines resembled where they had started on November 19th. But what rendered Cambrai historic wasn't what altered on the map, it was what altered in the mind. For the first time, military strategists had seen evidence that trench warfare could be breached. That through proper coordination of tanks, artillery, air power, and mobile infantry, even the strongest fortifications could be breached, at least for a short time. The mass deployment of tanks had shocked the Germans, and despite the mechanical monstrosities having their weaknesses, limited distance, susceptibility to artillery, bad communications, they had shown their possibilities. In future wars, tanks would no longer be an experimental gimmick. They would be incorporated into the military's tactics, and their numbers on the battlefield would increase. Cambrai also established the value of planned artillery shooting, a system of figuring out where to strike without showing hands through initial shelling. This would be a staple of new artillery tactics. The coordination that was evident at Cambrai, imperfect though it was a harbinger of the way wars would be fought in the 20th century. The era of trench stalemate was starting to crack, but even advancements, as Cambrai reminded everyone, have a cost. A mirror for the world. Throughout Europe, the aftermath of the battle resonated beyond the barbed wire. Newspapers once printing headlines of cheering now carried casualty lists that filled columns. English families received somber telegrams. German Rhineland homes grieved for sons not slain in heroic defense, but in a neglected sector that became an inferno. In London, Prime Minister David Lloyd George first welcomed the operation as a breakthrough, but when the counterattacks regained much of the lost ground, the backlash was back. Compliments came from General Julian Byng's supporters, praising him for his boldness. Others accused him of overextending himself. In Germany, Cambrai provided both fear and fuel for military minds. They had witnessed how near the Allies had approached the breakthrough, and how well their new tactics of infiltration had served to stop them. It was an odd battle, one that neither could wholly call their own, but which each learned from. But no politician, no general, no historian could ever sense what the soldiers did. For the men, there was no legacy, only survival. The living bore the fight with them. Some had survived under a tank, their faces an inch or two from its tracks. Others had survived a shell hit straight on, only to see their best mate killed in the same trench. Some walked out of Cambrai with wounds they would bear forever, others with dreams they couldn't escape. Private James Hardwick, who was 19 when he fought at Cambrai, never mentioned Cambrai during the war. His daughter would later testify, he never used his voice, but he'd go quiet sometimes, just wander off in the rain. I think he left half of him there. Men such as James became the unobtrusive designers of memory. They did not publish books or march on parades. They just survived. They went back to stores, to farms, to factories. But within them, they bore the woods of Borlon, the roar of tank engines failing, the scent of blood and chalky earth. And for those who did not come back, there were families, villages, whole towns left to mourn. The town of Cambrai, a witness to ruin, the town that lent the battle its name, had paid dearly. Although the most intense combat was out in the countryside and villages around Cambrai, the town itself had been occupied by Germans for years. The inhabitants, sandwiched between the two combatants, were subjected to shellfire from both sides. Many left, those who stayed huddled in basements, hoping not to be buried under collapsing masonry. When the fight was over, Cambrai was a ghost town. Its churches were without roofs, its houses blackened, its roads strewn with horses, helmets, and shattered hopes. Today the town is restored. Clean roads, restored cathedrals, flowers bloom where tanks churned mud. But underneath that rebirth, the foundations are drenched in memory. Monuments that whisper there is no Cambrai victory parade, no great cinematic epic. Cambrai survives in subtle ways, in cemeteries, where headstones run in unbroken lines to the horizon, many with nothing more than a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. In stone memorials, such as the Cambrai Memorial to the Missing at Louvre, where 7,048 British and South African names are inscribed in silence. In French village plaques, where farmers still lay flowers each year alongside the names of boys lost from both sides. In dusty diaries, faded with time, where men recorded flicker-lit woods, icy feet and buddies who didn't survive the night. And in these little acts of remembering, Cambrai lives, legacy in doctrine and steel. Although the trenches of Cambrai changed back and forth, the lessons remained. When the Allies launched their 100 Days Offensive in 1918, it was built on Cambrai's framework: coordinated attacks, mobile artillery, and tank infantry cooperation. This time they succeeded. In World War II, when tanks blitzed across France and Russia, their ancestors were the rumbling Mark IVs of Cambrai. The evolution was complete. The tank was no longer a novelty, it was the spearhead. Cambrai showed armies that the future of war was not in attrition, but in swiftness, coordination, surprise. It cost tens of thousands of lives to learn that. The battle's last legacy. If you go to Cambrai today, maybe on a still autumn afternoon, you'll find open fields, vast and empty, plowed fields, crows wheeling above, a gentle breeze blowing across undisturbed grass. You'll find neat villages with red-tiled roofs, tiny cafes, and school playgrounds full of laughter. But stop and listen, and you might hear more. The faraway rumble of something mechanical, remnants of those tanks that originally altered history. The wind whistle between trees that used to burn in Borlon wood. The soundless beat of boots, long past still marching in remembrance, because Cambrai isn't a location, it's a symbol, not of glory, not even triumph, but of transition, from the old to the new ways of war, from horse to machine, from sacrifice by instinct to vision by strategy, from myth to modernity, and more than anything, it's a reminder that even when the maps remain the same, the people never do.